Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. Welcome to Berechot, Chapter 2, Halacha 1. Now, today we're going to get into some of the most important conversation about doing mitzvahs, and that is about Kavanah and intention. And the first part of this shiur is going to be a two-part shiur on Chapter 2, Halacha 1. This is going to be part 1. And we're going to be covering issues on how to do the Shema and how to say it is going to get covered today, and also what's going to count and what's not going to count. Now, on the phone with us are a couple of really great rabbis, and we've been talking about this because earlier in Chapter 1, we had a thing about hefsek. And in Chapter 1, we were talking about 3 cases with hefsek. We had one case with leaning. What happens if you're leaning on the animal in order to dedicate it and then slaughter it before sacrifice at the temple? And you have a case of the washing of the hands so that you can do hamotzi, which, by the way, can also be done for the matzah for the Pesach, because that's a biblical obligation to eat the matzah, and definitely the washing of the hands outside of the temple. I mean, the Kohanim Doraita are required to wash their hands and their feet. That's in the Humash, but outside of there, outside of like in the table that we have today, the washing of the hands is going to be d'Rabbanan. And by the way, if the food is tahor and you're tamei from an av hatuma, then you can't, even if you wash your hands, you can't touch that food anyway if you're a Kohen. And then you have this other case about saying the Shema but having an interruption. One of the key ideas is whenever you're doing a mitzvah, you don't want to have an interruption. One of the ideas on not having an interruption is because you don't want to allow for things to become pasul or contaminated, or for something to happen to disqualify the mitzvah. So you always want to be rushing to do a mitzvah because you don't want the mitzvah to be disqualified or to go away. One of the other cases about having the hefsek is because you can lose kavanah. So let's say you're leaning on the animal and then it's going to get slaughtered. Well, there's knives everywhere, and they were worried, as we saw in Chapter 1, that perhaps it could develop a blemish. In other words, there's knives everywhere. Perhaps, the ankle could get nicked by a knife by accident because there's guys with knives all over the place. I mean, the temple in this area there was basically a slaughterhouse, and, things happen. And if the animal gets blemished, even though it was shechted or it got leaned on, and then just before it got shechted, even though it didn't have a blemish when you leaned on it and dedicated it, if it gets blemished, you can't use it. So you can't shecht it, and you can't put it on the altar. It's really forbidden. So you have to leave the animal out to graze until it develops a blemish, and then either you can leave it to die or they can sell it, things like that. And the temple has a way to process that. But the point is that if the animal doesn't get dinged, and if you lost your intention after you leaned on the animal, and then the animal gets slaughtered but you lost your intention, after the fact, does it still count as a valid offering? Yes, it doesn't get disqualified. But in the case of losing your intention when you're saying the Shema, did you do the obligation? No, you didn't do the obligation. So what's the difference between the leaning on the animal and the Shema? In any case, when you're leaning on the animal, you want to do the mitzvah in the best way. You don't want to lose your intention. That's not a good way to do it. And you never want to do mitzvahs without intention. You always want to do them with intention. But what we're going to be getting into today is the Shema. And that's going to be a case where if you didn't do the intention d'oraita, and you lost your intention and maybe there's a hefsek, you have to go back and do it again because you didn't do it. It's not the same case as that other mitzvah where you lost your intention, but did it retroactively still count and get done? In that case of leaning yes. In this case, no, it does not count d'oraita. Why would that be? Because the whole point of the Shema and what makes the Shema different for Kavanah is that you're accepting the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. So if your mind is not on the mitzvah, did you accept the yoke of heavenly sovereignty? No, you were thinking about clouds and you were daydreaming. So you weren't in the state of mind in order to accept the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. So it doesn't count. You didn't actually do it. You said it, but the point of the Shema is that your mind is internalizing it to accept the Hashem and the yoke of heaven, and not being present for it mentally and daydreaming and drifting. You didn't do it. So you have to say it with Kavanah or you didn't do it. There's going to be a lot of guys that go up to Shemayim and they're going to ask, why didn't you say the Shema? And the guy's going to say, what are you talking about? I said the Shema every day, twice a day. And they're going to say, no, you didn't. You did half the time. And they can say, what do you mean half the time? And they can say, look, half the time you were thinking about your money. Half the time you were thinking about your wife. Half the time you were thinking about the children. Half the time you were thinking about XYZ shtuyot, or you were daydreaming, or you weren't concentrating. And so you only did it half the time. Half the time you didn't do the Shema. The Torah commands you to do the Shema twice a day. They're going to ask you, how come you didn't do the Shema every day? It's such an easy thing. How come you didn't do it? And that's the point, is that you have to have Kavanah on it, because that's the point. You're accepting heavenly sovereignty. Now, I want to bring up something a little bit controversial. There's a couple of Amorim who hold that still did the mitzvah. That's going to be the case in a couple of cases. For instance, like if you were sitting at the table and you washed your hands and then you lost your kavanah and then you ate the matzah for Pesach, did you discharge your obligation? Yes, you did, and it counts, but that's not really a good way to do it. Again, you always want to do a mitzvah with intent. But again, this part is going to be where the point of doing this action is to direct your mind to the Shema. So let's get into the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if one was reciting the sections of the Shema in the Torah, and the time of the Shema recitation arrived, don't forget we were covering the times in chapter 1. Chapter 1 covers when do we say it at night and when do we say it in the morning. Anyway, so Baruch Hashem, this guy is studying Torah before the time of the Shema comes. But anyway, he was reciting sections of the Shema in the Torah, and the time of the Shema recitation arrived. And if he directed his mind to it, he discharged the obligation. But if not, he has not discharged the obligation. Now, the question is, well, what does that mean, directing your mind to it? And there's one way to look at it where, the person is reciting the passages for the sake of fulfilling the mitzvah of the Shema. In other words, that's trying to do it with intent, and that he's trying to discharge this ritual obligation, but he's doing it with a specific intent that it's to perform the mitzvah. And if the person said the Shema with that intention to perform the mitzvah by saying either the morning or the evening Shema, he has discharged it. But what would the opposite be? The opposite would be that if he recited the passages without the intent to perform the mitzvah, then he did not do the obligation. Even though he did the act, but he didn't do it with the intent to accept the yoke of Shemayim and the intent to do that mitzvah. And that's, again, what makes this mitzvah so different than some others. So, again, we want to be batting 100, and when we get to Shemayim, you want to get the pat on the back that says, wow, you did the Shema every day, twice a day. That's great. So this is how you do it. You have to do it where, yes, you're doing the action, and yes, you're doing it because only a Jew says the Shema, and you're doing it because this is the time, but you have to have the intention to do the mitzvah. So that's what's kind of unique about this. And that's what makes the Shema so special. And I can tell you something, that if you're talking to somebody that is not yet a Baal Tshuva, say to him, just say the Shema twice a day. And, one day it'll, Bezrat Hashem, plant a seed, and he'll start to become more into Torah observance. There's something very important about saying the Shema as a very basic thing for a Jew. And one of the things that you need to let him know is that that you have to do it with intent and Kavanah. So this is basically teaching that, if he's directing his mind to performing the mitzvah, he did the obligation, and if he did not do the obligation. And if he's doing the act, but he's preoccupied with some other activity, then he didn't really direct his mind, so he didn't do it. So if he's daydreaming, he also doesn't do it. You have to direct your mind. That's the point. And again, everybody agrees, and there's no disagreement on this, that this is accepting mentally the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. So there's other types of mitzvahs, not this one, that if the intent lapses, did you still do it? Yeah. So for instance, let's say you're giving tzedakah or something, okay, and you lost your intention to give the tzedakah. Did that still count as tzedakah? Yeah, it did, right? You still did the action. And but this one pertains specifically to the Shema, and other mitzvahs pertain to other mitzvahs. So, let's say you're doing peah, and you dedicate the field, but then you lose your intention while you're dedicating which part, but it's still dedicated, right? So did you do the obligation of peah? Yes. But in this is unique to other mitzvahs, because the recital itself has to have a form of intent. It's really important to internalize that, and that's why have been talking about this for the last 13 minutes, because you really have to dig into this part. This is a key part of the performance of this. And, under normal circumstances, you always want to have Kavanah, but this one is special because if you didn't have the Kavanah, you didn't do it. Okay, you got to do it again. So that's a really key idea. Now, the Mishnah now wants to talk about what happens if, somebody comes to greet you, and, are you going to be allowed to interrupt the recital of the Shema and those blessings to greet another one or to return a greeting? So under normal circumstances, you don't interrupt the recital of the Shema or the blessings, but the Mishnah is going to get into the exception of the rule. And I highly recommend everybody to check out the Halacha Lamaisa on Mishnah Beur, and you can find that in chapter 66, and specifically Safe 2, which talks about some of the exceptions nowadays. And you always want to check out the halacha lemaisa and exact functionality of any mitzvah in the Shulchan Aruch, because that's what it is. That's what we do. So the Mishnah reads, if one is at a point in between the paragraphs of the Shema or its blessings, he may interrupt and extend a greeting to another for the sake of that person's honor, and he may also return a greeting to one who extended it. And if he is in the middle of a paragraph of the Shema or one of its blessings, he may interrupt and extend a greeting only on account of fear. And he may also return a greeting. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda says, if one is in the middle of a paragraph of the Shema or one of its blessings, he may interrupt and extend a greeting only on account of fear. So Rabbi Meir is going to be more lenient on it. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying that only on account of fear, if you're in the middle of a paragraph, are you allowed to interrupt. But in the other cases, you are not. So again, please check the Mishnah Beur for the halacha lemaisa on all of this, and you can get the working of what it is going to be today. Now that's going to be Mishnah Beur 66. You can find it in Safe 2, Safe 3. Anyway, Rabbi Meir is asking, says the Haredim, that he may extend a greeting to an esteemed individual and one who is appropriate to greet first. So perhaps like a Rosh Yeshiva walks in, or perhaps the Rosh Memshalah walks in, or something like that, or the governor, or a very big Torah scholar or something. And this category includes a Torah scholar who is one's equal or superior, even an elderly person, by the way, or a wealthy person who deserves to be honored. So that's who it's talking about. Okay, it's not just talking about anyone. It's somebody who already has something worthy of honor. Okay. By the way, in the case of the elderly person, it's even if the person is elderly but unlearned. So that's going to be a fine point there. Anyway, this is not all necessarily halacha lemaisa. This is just going over the structure of this for coming up with what the halacha lemaisa is, and these are the points of Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara is going to question whether Rabbi Meir is going to talk about returning the greeting of somebody that is worthy of honor, or may he return a greeting to any other type of person. That's going to be coming up later. And the Gemara is going to come to clarify this other term about fear and returning a greeting out of fear, because that's going to be important for understanding what's happening with Rabbi Yehuda and his opinion, and also Rabbi Meir and his opinion. And when it's talking about this thing of fear, the Haredim says that in the case where somebody's life is in danger, one may certainly interrupt in the middle of the Shema, just like most every other mitzvah is deferred to save a life, so too it would be here. So really the question here, says the Haredim, is what need is there for the Tana to teach this here? And this, says the Haredim, is trying to explain that the Mishnah is referring to a parent or a teacher whom one is obligated to fear, in other words, to be in awe of. And so it doesn't necessarily mean giving a greeting, says the Rashi about this, to somebody who he fears who would kill him. This is talking about an esteemed individual. So you could always say, like, what the Haredim is saying is like, well, why would this be here? We always know that, if there's, pekuach nefesh and life risk, that of course mitzvahs can be put on hold for something. That's obviously not what it's talking about here. It's talking about somebody else. So that's a key point to keep in mind here. And the Mishnah is going to finish up with another point by Rabbi Yehuda. It said that if one is in the middle of a paragraph of the Shema, says Rabbi Yehuda, or one of the blessings, he may interrupt and extend a greeting only on account of fear. And it finishes and says, but he may return a greeting even for the sake of another person's honor. And if one is in between the paragraphs of the Shema or its blessings, he may interrupt and extend a greeting for the sake of another person's honor, and he may return a greeting to any person. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that we are more lenient with respect to returning a greeting than with respect to extending one. So on some of the points, it looks like Rabbi Meir is a little bit more lenient. And on this point, with returning a greeting, definitely Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient there. So perhaps you can read Rabbi Meir in most part of it actually as being more strict on this, and definitely in this way, Rabbi Yehuda is going to be more lenient with returning greetings to other people. So there's going to be a lot here, and we'll unpack it in the Gemara. Now, the Gemara is going to get into this idea of intention. It's a really key idea in Judaism, and you always want to be mindful of what you're doing. You want to always be in the moment. You always want to be doing the mitzvahs with intention, always. But the Shema is special because if you didn't do it with intention, you got to go back and do it again. You didn't do it. So very important note there. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about the Mishnah. It's going to say that, if one was reciting the sections of the Shema in the Torah and the time of the Shema recitation arrived, if he directed his mind to it, he has discharged the obligation. The Gemara now is going to draw an inference from this ruling. This, by the way, is not necessarily going to be accepted by everybody, but nonetheless, this is here for us to learn from. Rabbi Ba said, this tells us that the blessings that precede and follow Shema are not essential to the Shema recitation, and if one omitted these blessings, he has still discharged his obligation to recite the Shema. So I want to point out what the Haredim is saying about this. He's saying that the Mishnah requires one who is reciting from the Torah only to direct his mind to the Shema recitation, implying that this itself enables him to discharge the obligation. Now, since he was reading from the Torah, he obviously did not recite the blessings that precede and following the Shema, that follows Shema. And the Haredim is saying about this that clearly the recitation of the blessings is not essential to discharging one's Shema obligation. This is not the Haredim's opinion. This is not the Halacha L'maisa. This is just a Gemara so that we can get a starting point to start to put this thing together. So the Haredim is just explaining what Rabbi Ba is saying. So the Haredim continues about this, and he says that on Rabbi Ba's point, this does not mean that the person is exempt from reciting the blessings, according to what Rabbi Ba is saying. And the Haredim is explaining that what Rabbi Ba is saying, and again, not necessarily what the Haredim says or does for himself, but we're trying to understand the point of Rabbi Ba here, okay? Even though this is not what we do or follow or what it is, but we still want to understand what it is. So Haredim about Rabbi Ba's point says that it means only that his omission of the blessings does not impede his fulfillment of the basic obligation to recite the scriptural passages of the Shema. And having completed the recital of these passages, the person must still recite the blessings, for their recital each day is mandatory. So the Haredim says that he is free, however, from repeating the scriptural passages, and thus he recites the blessings in sequence without interposing the Shema passages. And although these blessings were composed to accompany the Shema, they can be recited by themselves since they are not specific Shema blessings. That is, that they do not contain the clause, "He who has commanded us to recite the Shema," but merely discuss themes related to the Shema. So I want to point out something here about Shulchan Aruch, and that's you can also find more in the Orach Chaim in chapter 60, Safe 2. And over there in Shulchan Aruch, it states that one should repeat the scriptural Shema passages, and this is because the Mishnah's ruling that he discharges obligation pertains only to the mitzvah of reciting the Shema, but since he has yet to pray, it is proper for him to repeat the passages so as to stand in prayer from within recitation of the Torah passage. So I just want to point out that there are some Rishonim, like Rav Goan, who maintain that when the Yerushalmi states that the omission of the blessings does not impede fulfillment of the Shema obligation, it refers only to the obligation of a private individual, but with respect to the congregation, the recitation of the blessings is essential. This all is going to not necessarily be, again, what Rabbi Ba is talking about is a fine point, but it's not necessarily the halacha l'maisa. So we're going to get into a challenge to Rabbi Ba's inference, and the Gemara says that they challenged this assertion as follows. Does one who is reciting the Shema for the sake of the mitzvah not have to interrupt between the first verse in the Shema recitation and the second? And of course he does. I mean, he does have to, right? So we know that, the first passage of Shema is written in the Torah where it says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, and then it says, you shall love Hashem your God. So when you're saying the Shema, one is required to make an interruption between the end of the first verse and the beginning of the second verse, and this means that at the end of the first verse, he must prolong the word Echad in order to concentrate that Hashem is the one and only in the heavens and on earth and in the four directions. And so the Haredim points out that anyone who fails to pause and concentrate on this has not discharged the obligation. That's a key point about what this is stating. Now, ordinarily, one who is reading the Shema passage in the Torah does not make this interruption between the verses. Okay, so the Gemara continues, and it says, "Yet the Tana did not teach this stipulation in the Mishnah, that one discharges his obligation only if he directs his mind and interrupts between the first two verses. For the sake of shortness, the Tana omitted the stipulation, which he considered to be obvious." So the Gemara continues and says, here, in regard to the requirement of saying the blessings, we may say that even though the Tana did not teach it in the Mishnah, Gemara says one is absolutely required to recite the blessings before and after the Shema in order to discharge the obligation. So that what the Haredim says about this is that perhaps the Tana omitted this requirement because he considered it to be too self-evident. So, says the Haredim, Rabbi Ba's inference is rejected that one cannot infer from the Mishnah's omission of the requirement to recite the blessings that they are not essential to the Shema recitation. So the Haredim says that possibly the blessings combined with the scriptural passages form a single cohesive unit which must be recited as a whole. So I just want to point out something from the Mara Fulda, that if a person is reciting from the Torah in order, he surely pauses between the passages long enough to complete them, and he cannot discharge the obligation with this kind of reading. And therefore, when the Mishnah states that he discharges the obligation, it means that this is so if he skips from place to place in the Torah and avoids a lengthy pause between the passages. Yet the Mishnah does not bother to mention it, and says the Mara Fulda, it follows that perhaps, although the Mishnah also omits any mention of the blessings, because they too are essential to the recitation. So the Gemara now is gonna talk about a teaching that's very similar to this, so that we can understand this point on what they're saying by this Tana with this anonymous sugya here. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef said, if you will say that one is required to recite the blessings specifically with a Shema, and he does not discharge his obligation for the Shema, and he does not discharge his Shema obligation if he omits the blessings, then the law must be that one who recites the blessings must direct his mind in his recitation of all of them. Okay, so the Haredim is saying that all the blessings must be recited with proper concentration on their meaning. And in regard to the Shemona Esrei, the law is that one discharges his obligation even if he concentrates only on the first blessing. But in regard to the Shema blessings, one cannot discharge his obligation unless he concentrates on all of them. So that's the key point here. The key point here is that the structure of the Shema mitzvah means you have to have Kavanah on it. And of course, you never want to have sex with it. You don't want to have anything that could come up that can ruin the beauty of the mitzvah, the performance of the mitzvah, but also something that could take away your kavanah, so you don't get the credit for the mitzvah. So implicit within the mitzvah of the Shema has to be that you have full concentration on that mitzvah and the recitation, and your mind is in it. You didn't drift off. Your mind is in the moment of doing this mitzvah and internalizing it and accepting the heavenly yoke. And if you didn't do the mitzvah. That's what Rabbi Yosef is saying, that he must direct his mind in the recitation. So, you could consider, you do consider the blessings essential to the Shema recitation. And the Gemara continues and says that, and this wording informs us that one must direct his mind in his recitation with all the passages of the Shema. So that the Haredim says about this, by simply stating if he directed his mind without specifying any passage or passages, the Mishnah implies that one must concentrate throughout the Shema recitation from the beginning to the end. And the Gemara assumes that the Mishnah refers to the concentration on the meaning of the passages, says the Haredim. Rabbi Yosef is trying to establish that if the Shema recitation blessings are really going to be part connected with these other scriptural passages, then really all of these other passages as well require concentration, not any less than any other part of saying the Shema itself. That's, I think, the key point of Rabbi Yosef's idea here. He's trying to equate the blessings with the scriptural passages. And so really what Rabbi Yosef's point is that, one must direct his mind on the recitation of all the blessings in the passages for the Shema. The Gemara now wants to find support for this assertion. And the Gemara says, let us learn this above law, from the following brisa. The Gemara says, Rabbi Achai says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, if one directed his mind in his recitation of the first passage of the Shema, then even though he did not direct his mind in his recitation of the second passage, he has discharged the obligation. The Haredim says about this that the Gemara does not consider the above inference from the Mishnah to be conclusive, and the Haredim is saying basically what Rabbi Achai's point in the name of Rabbi Yehuda is that although the Mishnah does not qualify its requirement of concentration, this must reflect a desire for brevity, and the Mishnah might actually mean to require concentration only during the recitation of the first passage. And if this is the meaning, then there is no basis for assuming the concentration is essential even during the recitation of the blessings and other parts. So the Gemara now is going to turn to the source and a brisa for Rabbi Yosef's assertion. This, by the way, has parallel in the Bavli in page 13, so you can follow along over there and see what's going on over there. So the brisa is basically implying that only in the second passage, where it's talking about Vehaya im Shemoa, that the concentration there is not essential. But in the third passage, where it says the Vayomer part, the concentration is essential. And since they're basically equating the blessings with scriptural passages, it follows that the concentration is essential to reciting of the blessings as well. So the Haredim and his approach is basically saying that the Gemara makes two separate points. That one is that Rabbi Ba's inference from the Mishnah that the blessings are not essential to the recitation of the Shema passages is going to be rejected. According to the Haredim, that the Mishnah may hold that the blessings are essential and one does not do the obligation of the Shema unless he recites the scriptural passages together with the blessings. Now, point two the Haredim makes about what this Gemara makes, because he's saying it makes 2 points. And the second point of what the Haredim is saying that this Gemara says and means is that point 2 is assuming that the blessings are essential. The requirement of concentration pertains to the blessings as well as the scriptural parts of the Shema, except the second passage. Again, if you want to know halacha l'maisa, always go back to the Shulchan Aruch and look. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a building where we're trying to put things together and see what it is. So again, when you're seeing this, all of this is not necessarily halacha l'maisa. We're trying to work out what's going to be for what we do today, and it's trying to work through different traditions, because Rabbi Ba's point is actually very nuanced, and Rabbi Ba is coming with a tradition, but these other rabbis have a different tradition, and so we're trying to go through the points of it. Basically, we're trying to come up with what's going on with this dispute with the Tanaim. Basically, going to be trying to figure out whether concentration is going to be essential to these scriptural passages. This is basically what we're trying to work through here. So the Gemara is going to analyze the Barisa's distinction between the first 2 passages of the Shema, and the Gemara says, what is the difference between the first passage and the second passage? In other words, what this is asking is they're saying, why is it that concentration is going to be essential and required during, when you say the first part, but not during when you say the second part. Now, for you, this, and for me, this is really, really helpful because this is going to help us to get an understanding of deeper points of what you're doing when you're saying the first part. You could look at the words and you can say, oh, it's like this, right? But this is really going to give you also what is the deeper meaning of what is the first part of it and what is the second part of it. So Rabbi Hanina said, whatever is written in this passage, the first one, is written in that passage, the second one. Basically, what Rabbi Hanina is pointing out is that since the content of the second one is included in the first one, even if one did not direct his mind to the later one, he did the obligation because it's basically already covered in the first one. The Gemara is going to counter that. It's going to say, accordingly, one should be required to recite only one of these passages, just the first one. So why does the second one have to be recited at all? In other words, says the Haredim, that the first passage surely has to be recited since it contains the acceptance of sovereignty of heaven and Hashem's oneness. Once that passage is recited, Haredim is asking about what this sugya means. He's saying that the sugya says that, why do you need to say the second one, which is basically a repetition of the first one. And the Gemara is going to answer that. Rabbi Illa said, the first passage is directed to each and every individual, while the second passage is directed to the congregation at large. And furthermore, the first passage refers to the study of Torah, while the second passage refers to the active fulfillment of its commandments. So when you say the Shema, you're going to now know that the first part is talking about you, the individual. And the second part is going to talk about the congregation of Am Yisrael at large. And when you do the first part, you're going to see that the first part is referring to Torah study, and the second is the active fulfillment of mitzvot and the commandments. So that's a deeper point about this structure, and it's a deeper point so that you understand what you're doing, so that you can do the mitzvah in a way that's going to bring you a more spiritual experience. Now, the Haredim points out something that we all should keep in mind, which is that each member of the community is ultimately an individual, and the study of Torah ultimately leads to the active fulfillment of mitzvot, and the lessons of the second passage are largely included in the first, and the Haredim is adding that for this reason, only the second passage is excluded from the consecration requirement, but the third passage is not. Now, there's other commentators who have other views. This is just the view of the Haredim. If you want to get what is the halacha l'maisa on all of this, always go back to the Shulchan Aruch and check. Anyway, the Gemara is going to give another opinion as to the extent to which the concentration is essential during the Shema recitation. Bar Kapara said, there is no part of the Shema recitation that absolutely requires concentration except for the first three verses alone. Well, that's a big chiddush. So what Bar Kapara is saying, the Haredim says that Bar Kapara is a Tana and is thus entitled to disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, who ruled that concentration is essential throughout the first and third passages. He's pointing out Bar Kapara definitely refers to concentrating on the meaning of the verses, not concentrating on the fulfilling of the mitzvah. So that when he's talking about concentration, he's saying that it's not just that, oh, I did the Shema. You have to try to internalize, says Bar Kapara, says the Haredim about this, you have to be concentrating on the meaning of the verses, not just that you're trying to do the mitzvah. So that each and every sentence in there, you have to try to understand what does that mean. That's the point of Bar Koppera here. And that he's also implying that according to Bar Koppera, since concentration is not essential to the entirety of the Shema itself, to the Shema recitation itself, says the Haredim, it surely is not essential to the blessings that accompany the Shema. But again, what they're pointing out is that you have to be concentrating on the meaning. So that's a big hiddush. It's very important, and it's something that we want to understand better so we can do it in a better way. The Gemara is now going to give support for this ruling, and the Gemara says, and it was taught similarly in a Baraisa. The fourth verse of the Shema passage states, and you shall articulate them. And this teaches that the verses until here are subject to the requirement of concentration. And the Gemara says, and from here forward, they are subject only to the requirement of articulation. So I want to bring out that a commentary by the Pnei Moshe here about this, and it's saying that the third verse of the passage, which is basically talking about let these words that I command you today be upon your heart, and where it's saying that upon your heart is teaching that until this point the passage must be recited with concentration. And then the fourth verse says, and you shall articulate them. And basically that's teaching that the remainder of the passage may be articulated without concentration, but the other part before that must be with concentration. And not only that, says Bar Koppera, and implied by Bar Koppera, that it's not just concentrating on fulfilling the mitzvah, but concentrating on the meaning of the verses. So you have to really have your head in this mitzvah where you're trying to understand what does each line mean. That's the point by Bar Koppera. There's going to be a related teaching now. And Rabbi Huna said of Rabbi Uri, who cited Rav Yosef, who cited Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. So this ultimately now is going over to Bavel on this, and what is basically in this chain of transmission. And again, this is showing how beautiful Judaism is, which is that you can see the same ancient things in your prayer book today, and you can see a chain of transmission here in the Gemara. And here they're coming to take you today in this generation and teach you the tradition so you can do it the right way, like how they have it, because they've been given a tradition all the way since Moshe Rabbeinu, and that you in this day and age can still be accessing that tradition all the way back. And that's why we want to learn about it, so that we can do it the right way. We don't want to just be Jewish. We want to be Jewish and do the mitzvot and do it in the same way that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers have been doing it, because that's the right way to do it. And there's a deeper spiritual reward for trying to do it where you're sticking to the tradition. You always want to stick to the tradition. So what's Shmuel's point? Saying that one must accept the yoke of the heavenly kingdom upon himself while standing. So this is going to parallel over to Bavli in 13b, and I highly recommend you take a look at the Tosafot over there. And basically what the Tosafot is saying about this parallel that you have in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, the Tosafot really sums it up in a great way. He says that the portion of the Shema recital for which the concentration is essential, either the first verse or the first three verses or the entire passage should be recited while standing, as this is conducive to concentration. So again, we're getting into body posture. By the way, just want to point out the Tosafot are a group of rabbis from like Alsace-Lorraine and German area, and they were around the period of time, plus or minus around the time of Rashi. Some a little, most of them a little bit later, some a little bit around that time. But anyway, it's a group of very well-regarded Gedolim of the day, and what the Tosafot, these groups of sages, and again, I'm not sure which Tosafot wrote this, but anyway, but the Tosafot says that the standing is conducive to concentration. So again, body posture ends up being an important part of Judaism. I mean, we've been covering the last two chapters in the first tractate of the Shas, and we're getting into a lot of things about body posture. So one of the key points that they have here is that they're saying to stand, because the standing is going to help you with your concentration. So that's really how important the concentration is in order to do the mitzvah. Because again, if you didn't concentrate on the meaning of the words, you didn't do it. So again, if you want to know the fine points of how we do these things today, please check the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is unanimous. Every Jew accepts it. Every Jew is required to accept it, and every group accepted it. So whether you're Lubavitch, or you're going to be a Breslover, or you're going to be a Belz Hasid, or you're going to be from Ger, or you're going to be a Litvish, or you're going to be Yekish, or you're going to be from Morocco, and you're going to follow the rabbis and Gedolim there, you got to follow the Shulchan Aruch. Everybody says it, and it's going to help you to get the halacha l'maisa. That's what we do. But anyway, we're trying to build a structure to try to understand this mitzvah in a richer way. So Gemara now wants to analyze this ruling, and it says, what does this mean? Does it mean that if one was sitting, he must stand up to recite the Shema? So that's a good question. In other words, the Haredim is saying that sitting is more conducive to concentrating than standing, and the Rosh Cirilio is pointing out that others are going to explain it as follows. Rosh Cirilio is going to explain it as follows. He's going to say that why Bet Shammai are the ones who rule that they must stand up for the morning Shema, whereas Bet Hillel permits that you could say it while standing. Can it be that Shmuel rules in accordance with Bet Shammai? So Rosh Cirilio reminds us about a conversation and a Mishnah that happened in chapter 1 Halacha 3 in Berechot, which is talking about the posture of saying the Shema. So perhaps it looks like Shmuel is advocating for Bet Shammai. Now, of course, it's not going to be true, but what's going on here? So the Gemara is going to respond and say, no, it means that if one was walking, he must stand still. So they clarify it, because that basically the point here is that Bet Hillel also holds that one may recite the Shema while working or walking, and basically they're agreeing that one should stand in place while reciting the portion of the Shema, because concentration is essential for that. So that if you want to take a look at the Mishnah Beur about this, you can find it in chapter 63, Saif 9, and it says that this is only an initial requirement, and if one recited the critical portion while walking, but he managed to concentrate on its meaning, he has discharged the obligation. So that's part of what's going on here. So There's a lot going on with posture. There's a lot going on with posture on it, not only for concentration, but also because of how they're trying to read uh, the scriptural part in the Torah for dispatching the obligation. So, which part here is going to technically be Deraita and Derabanan? You have to ask a Torah scholar on that. But all these parts here are very important, and you can see that what everybody can agree on is that you have to really try to internalize this and do it with Kavanah, and that you have to try to really not just accept the yoke of heaven, and that's the point of the mitzvah, but you have to really try to understand the meaning of the verses when you're doing it. So there's going to be another law pertaining to concentration during the Shema, and now it's going to tell you how to do it. So it was taught in a Brisa, one must prolong his pronunciation of the word echad. That's the one at the last part of it, where it's basically meaning, the one and only. And that's, at the end of the first verse of the Shema. And that's what it says in the Torah. And this ruling is going to get explained, okay? So Rav Nachman, the son of Rabbi Yaakov, said, and the letter echad requiring lengthening is specifically the daled. So the Rashi in the parallel in the Bavli 13b explains that when prolonging the word echad, which has the letters aleph, chet, and daled, one should not stretch out the letter chet, for at that point he is uttering only ech, which is a meaningless sound. Rather, he should prolong the letter daled, thereby having completed the word. So that's a very key insight by the always amazing Rashi in the Bavli parallel about this, and so very important to stress the daled and not to stress the chet in the middle of it, because you effectively didn't pronounce anything or say anything. You said something meaningless, and we're trying to do something not meaningless, but with the most meaning in the world. The most meaning in the world is to accept the oneness of Hashem and the Ein Od Mavado idea of the reality that we're living in, that there's nothing other than Hashem, that everything is in a totality of Ein Od Mavado. That's the deepest idea in the universe. The deepest idea that you could study ever is the idea of Ein Od Mavado. And the deepest idea that you could start to look at is the oneness. And that's why the first mitzvah in the Torah is to know Hashem. So the Sumchos Bar Yosef said, whoever prolongs the pronunciation of the word echad has his days and years prolonged favorably. So that's a brisa. And so why should your years and days be prolonged, but not only prolonged, but favorably prolonged? Why should that be? Because the most essential idea of all existence, of all reality, is that there's only one God, and that God is everything. It's the biggest idea there is. Some people will be attracted to say the biggest idea in the world is making money. The biggest idea in the world is my stock portfolio. The biggest idea in the world is that I'm aging and I have a certain amount of years to live. Some sort of materialistic pursuit, perhaps, but and some scientists will, foolishly say that the biggest idea in the world is that we're a monkey, God forbid, and other nonsense. No, the biggest idea in the world is is the articulation and the expression of oneness, and that there is no other reality except for Hashem. That's the biggest idea in the universe. There's nothing bigger than that. And the biggest thing that you can do is to try to know Hashem. That's the first mitzvah. So that if you're internalizing it and actively trying to do it with concentration and honor, and your head is really in it, then you're going to have a reward, and your years will be prolonged, and you're going to see a lot of blessing, because you're doing really something that's the most important thing in the world. You might think that the most important thing in the world is to get up and to go out and to rush after money, but that's not true. The most important thing in the world is to try to understand Ein Od Mavado. You are here to try to understand and to know Hashem. That's why you're here. You're not here to make money to go pay the rent. That's not what you're here for. So the Gemara is going to talk about an incident about where they're prolonging it. And Rabbi Yerushalmi used to prolong the word echad a great deal. And Rabbi Zera said to him, you do not need to prolong it so much. Rather, you should prolong it enough to mentally acknowledge Hashem's sovereignty in heaven and on earth and in the four directions of the world. So there's a lot going on here. The Maharsha says about this in the Bavli parallel in page 13b that Rabbi Yerushalmi was excessively prolonging the word echad in order to contemplate the hidden esoteric meanings of the verse. And Rabbi Zera warned him that by doing so, he would fall behind the rest of the congregation and not recite Shemona Esrei prayer with them, which is required. And rather, Rabbi Zera told Rabbi Yerushalmi that it's enough to contemplate that Hashem is the sole master above and below and in all four directions. And by the way, what this is a clue to is that on Sukkot, when you have the lulav and the etrog, and you're shaking it, you're moving it in the six directions, because we live in a multi-dimensional universe where we have up and down and left and right and forward and back. That's six dimensions, and you are doing it through the dimension of time. So that what you're really trying to do is mentally acknowledge that Hashem is above time and material and all the other dimensions that are below that. That basically Hashem is outside of time and space, and Hashem is above that. And by the way, there's a Gemara in Menachos that is in the Yerushalmi that has the only statement in either Shas with a lot of the Amorim explaining how Hashem is outside of time and space, and you can find that in the Geneza manuscript in the Yerushalmi. Anyway, there's going to be a related discussion that Rav, while he was a student, while he was a student in Rebbe's yeshiva, he asked Rabbi Chia the Great, I do not see Rebbe accept upon himself the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. And basically what he's saying is he never observed him interrupt the lecture to recite the morning Shema. So that's basically what Rav is hinting at here, saying. And the Gemara continues and says, Rav Chia replied, when you see Rebbe place his hand over his face, he accepts upon himself the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. And the Gemara continues and says, Rav further said to Rabbi Chia, but is Rebbe not required to mention the Exodus of Egypt daily during the time allotted for the recitation? And the Gemara says, Rabbi Chia replied, it is inconceivable that Rebbe does not at some point during his daily lecture, direct the discussion toward the subject of the Exodus. Basically, what Rabbi Chia is pointing out, this is Rabbi Chia the Great, he's saying that without interruption in the lecture, he discharges the obligation because at the time where the Exodus is required to be within that allotted amount of time, he directs the conversation of his shiur to the Exodus of Egypt and therefore dispatches that part of the obligation. Wow, how amazing is that? So now there's another inference from Rebbe's practice. Rav Tav Yome inquired of Rabbi Chizkiah, does this not tell us that no part of the Shema recitation requires concentration except for the first verse alone? And in other words, what this is asking is, why then did we learn from our brisa above that the first three passages of the Shema, from the beginning until the phrase where it says you shall articulate them, are required, are the subject of this concentration? And what's the answer? Rabbi Chizkiah replies to him, and he said to Rav Tav Yome, no, you may not infer this from Rebbe's practice, for within that time, when his hands were over his eyes, he would actually recite the first three verses of the Shema until the phrase, and you shall articulate them, and he would not merely recite the first verse. So basically what this is saying is that when he would say the Shema in the shiur, he would say with the concentration all of the verses. He didn't just put his hands over his face and say the Shema. He said all the verses, and then he would continue, and then he would direct effectively the conversation back to the statement of Exodus from Egypt somewhere in it, and thereby dispatch the obligation. Now, tomorrow we're going to get into finer points of interruption, and we're going to get into more explanation of other halachas with interruption. But just as a basic starting point, when you say the Shema every day, you need to put your head into the mitzvah of recognizing the sovereignty of Hashem in the universe and how he's the master above time and space in all the dimensions, and that the other thing is that you have to have your head, like Bar Koppler said, inside the mitzvah of understanding what the verses you're saying actually means. And if you lost your concentration, you got to go back and do it again. And if you do the action without the concentration, it doesn't count. And when you get to Shemayim, they're going to ask you on such and such day, how come you didn't say the Shema like you're supposed to in the Torah? So you have to have your head in the mitzvah. And like always, it's always best to do every single mitzvah with Kavanah. Have a great day.